Have you ever noticed how some days your life runs like clockwork? You wake up, go through the motions, get to work, and put in a full day. And in that day, you divide it up even further with lunch, and if you're lucky, a break or two. Maybe you even have daily routines in how you tackle your work. Or not. Sometimes you can be out of sync. But what if we could maximize the time in our days by taking advantage of the effects that our natural daily rhythms have on our brains? After all, we always hear timing is everything. Daniel Pink is the author of the new book out this week called When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. And he's in Washington, D.C. Mr. Pink, welcome to Quirks and Quarks.
It is great to be here, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Now, in your book, you describe a place called the Hospital of Doom. What kind of a hospital is that?
It's a very dangerous hospital. Here's what happens in that hospital. Anesthesia errors are 4 times more likely than they are at other hospitals. Nurses much less likely to wash their hands. Physicians treating patients much more likely to prescribe unnecessary antibiotics. Endoscopists performing colonoscopies find only half as many polyps in routine colonoscopies. And this hospital, though, is a place of sorts. It's really what happens in hospitals in the afternoons. There's a huge amount of research out there showing that medical care can be quite dangerous in the afternoon, especially compared with the morning. So the Hospital of Doom is hospitals in afternoons. Now, there's some remedies for this, so it's not all bad. But as a father, as a husband, as someone who will occasionally go to the doctor, I actually will do everything I can not to schedule any significant doctor appointment or visit to the hospital in the afternoon.
Boy, so you're saying this is a real thing?
Well, I mean, it's a real phenomenon, and it comes out through a lot of research. For instance, some of the work looked at, and one of the exciting things about what's happening in the world of research right now is the ability to look at gigantic data sets. So some of this research, for instance, comes from a study of 9,000 hospitals where you can look at incidences of, so let's say, anesthesia errors. And what it finds is that anesthesia errors are 4 times more likely for procedures that begin at 3 p.m. compared with procedures that begin at 9 a.m. So a 4x difference is pretty significant.
It is. Now, what's going on in our brains? What kind of cognitive change occurs throughout the course of a day?
It's hard to put a pin straight through that. What we know and what the science of timing is telling us is that we tend to go through a day in 3 stages of sorts. One is, you can call it the peak. That's often when our mood is highest and when we're very good at analytic tasks, heads down kind of work that requires focus and vigilance. Then another stage is that I call the trough, which is when a lot of bad stuff happens. So if you look at incidences of car accidents, for instance, once you adjust for the number of cars on the road, the most likely time for a car accident is between 4 and 6 a.m. Not a big surprise. The second most likely time is between 2 and 4 p.m. So there's something about this trough that is dangerous. We sag a little bit. And then there's also a third stage called the recovery, which for most people is the late afternoon and early evening. So these 3 stages, peak, trough, recovery, seem to be the pattern by which we go through a typical day. That's true for most of us in that order. People who are strong night owls go through in the reverse order: recovery, trough, peak. But regardless, that trough period, that afternoon, there's some fairly alarming research out there. There's some good research out of Denmark, led by Francesca Gino at Harvard, showing that kids score systematically lower on standardized tests and afternoon tests versus morning tests. It's an effect equal to missing 2 weeks of school.
Boy, well, if the trough is in the afternoon, when's the peak?
For most people, it's the morning. Not necessarily a precise time in the morning, but one of the ways that scholars have gotten at this is a great piece of research out of Cornell that looked at 500 million tweets. And there's software out there now that allows scholars to analyze text by putting massive amounts of text into a piece of software, and the text will measure the emotional level of the words that are being used. So they take 500 million tweets, none of which fortunately were from our president here in the United States. And they throw these tweets into this program to measure the emotional valence of these things. And what they found is a change is that kind of pattern in mood. A peak in the morning, a trough in the early afternoon, and a recovery in mood in the late afternoon. And these kinds of patterns of mood have a distinct effect on performance. They have a distinct effect in many domains of life. We've talked about healthcare. We've talked about education. You see it also in our judicial system. There's interesting experimental evidence showing that jurors are more likely to resort to racial stereotypes in afternoon deliberations than in morning deliberations.
But you mentioned in your book that it's not just mood that changes, it's an actual change in our cognition, our ability to think. Now, how serious is that compared to, say, the effect of alcohol?
Well, there's some people who have said that the difference between the daily high point and the daily low point in our performance based on time is equivalent to having several drinks. And what's key here is that we know from the research that we should do certain things at certain times of day. So during our peak, again, which for most of us is the morning, for night owls is later in the afternoon and the early evening, that's when we should be doing our analytic work, that heads down work. That's when we are most vigilant. To the extent possible, we should try to focus our work, that kind of work in that period. During the trough, we're better off doing our kind of administrative work, the more brainless work like answering emails or filling out reports. And during the recovery, which again for most of us is the late afternoon and early evening, it's actually a really interesting combination. What you see is elevated mood, but you see decline, less vigilance. So you're in a better mood than you were during the trough, but you're less vigilant than you were during the peak. And that combination of higher mood and reduced vigilance makes it actually quite good for creative work, things like brainstorming sessions. And what the research shows is that time of day explains about 20% of the variance in human performance on these kinds of workplace tasks.
Well, take me inside the body and brain. What's the science of how this daily rhythm plays out?
Well, what's interesting is that this kind of research began in the 18th century when biologists started looking at the behavior of plants and when they opened and closed. And over time, they started looking at the performance of human beings. And, it's very, very complicated. And one of the things that's come out recently is this idea that we don't have a biological clock. People love that phrase, but it's really a metaphorical phrase, this biological clock. What we essentially have, though, and there's some interesting evidence, some people won the Nobel Prize in medicine in 2017 for some of this research. Each cell essentially has its own clock, that we are in many ways temporal-based, clock-based creatures, and it has a big effect on our lives. And the way I look at it is that we're not taking that seriously enough. We take very seriously these questions of what do we do? We take seriously these questions of how we're going to do it. We take seriously these questions of who we're going to do it with, but we relegate these questions of when to second-order questions, third-order questions, and they really matter a lot. Now, the good news here is that there's a remedy that we know about that can mitigate some of the damage, and that remedy is very simple. It's taking breaks, taking more breaks, and taking certain kinds of breaks.
Take me through that. What kind of breaks are you talking about?
15 years ago, in certain workplace cultures, people would come into the office and say, I only got 2 hours of sleep last night. I pulled an all-nighter. And, we'd look at them as heroes. They were the people who were really devoted, who were tough, who were committed. Then the science of sleep began emerging, and we realized that those people were fools. They were actually hurting their performance. They might be hurting our performance because we have to work with them. To my mind, the science of breaks is where the science of sleep was 15 years ago, that it's about to break through the surface. What it's showing is that breaks matter significantly in our mood and our performance, particularly during that trough period. And we also know some of the design principles of effective breaks. We know that it's better to do something rather than nothing. A short break is very helpful. You don't have to do a 2-hour siesta to get the benefits of a break. You can take a 10-minute break. We know, and there's a huge amount of research, and I think your listeners probably know a lot of this. There's great research showing it's important to move rather than be sedentary during those breaks. There's some powerful research showing the effects of being exposed to nature, that nature ends up being restorative and replenishing in a way that for me really blew me away. We know that social breaks are often more effective than solo breaks, at least when we can choose who we're taking a break with. This is true even for introverts. And we know, and this is important in our world where everybody is looking at their phone or listening to a podcast all day long, that semi-detached is not as good as fully detached. You need to fully detach. So in some ways, the platonic ideal of a break would be to take a 10-minute, 15-minute break, go for a walk outside with somebody you like. And we tend to think of breaks as a deviation from performance, but in fact, they're actually part of performance. And I had it reversed in my own life. I always thought, amateurs take breaks and pros don't, but it's the exact opposite. Professionals take breaks. Amateurs are the ones who don't take breaks.
Now, some people don't have the option, though, to rearrange their day or even take breaks in some cases. I'm thinking of that scary hospital of doom you talked about earlier, because real lives are at stake there. You know, a case comes in the afternoon, they have to deal with it.
Absolutely.
So how do they get through that afternoon slump?
Absolutely. Well, there are a number of things that the medical profession has done. One of them is, I mentioned the hand washing deteriorates in hospitals in the afternoons. And one of the best remedies there has been giving nurses breaks, particularly social breaks. That ends up bringing the hand washing compliance way up. But one of the things in medical settings that hospitals and physicians have started to do is be more intentional about taking even short breaks, timeouts. So I was observing some surgeries at the University of Michigan Medical Center, and before a particular procedure began, the doctors, they're assembled around this fellow with a broken jaw. They're about to administer anesthesia to this person, and before they do anything, everybody around that table takes a step back. They pause. They go through a checklist, and then other points in the procedure, they take another pause. So they're much more deliberate, they're much more intentional about taking those kinds of even short breaks to mitigate some of the potential damage of that time of day. And it makes a huge difference.
Well, we're nearing the end of this interview. What do endings like this mean for how we perceive things?
Endings have a huge effect on our behavior. They can energize us to pursue certain kinds of goals. Endings help us encode. They help us evaluate and record experiences. So certainly customer transactions, how that transaction ends has a huge effect on how that customer will remember it. But one of the things that I find really interesting, and perhaps for me personally, the most useful piece of advice, how many times in my life have I said, I've got some good news and some bad news? Okay, everybody has said that. So what do you give first, the good news or the bad news? What I had always done is give the good news first, to try to be a nice guy, lay down a cushion. But what the research shows is that 4 out of 5 people prefer to get the bad news first. And the reason for that has to do with our approach to endings. Given a choice, we prefer endings that elevate. We prefer rising sequences to declining sequences. So this is one of the ways this research has changed my own behavior. Not only am I taking more breaks, but I am the king of giving the bad news first and then doing the good news.
Mr. Pink, thank you for your time for the book. And please go take a break.
I plan to take a break immediately after this.
Thanks again. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Daniel Pink is the author of the new book, When? The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. Now, we've got a copy of this book to give away. Just email us at quirks@cbc.ca and put timing in the subject line. One person will be picked at random to get a copy.